What's up, everybody? Professor Parsons here, coming to you from what I'm going to call the philosophy garage. I have a fire going in my wood stove. I have a hot cup of coffee, and hot cups of coffee and fires are just some of the best things for doing philosophy. But without further ado, let's go ahead and get started here. In this video, I'm going to be talking about environmentalism and private property. And this is related to David Schmidt's article on the institution of property, as well as Carol Rose's and Mark Pennington's. We're not going to cover Mark Pennington's article on free market environmentalism, where he gives a defense of free market environmentalism, but everything we're talking about in this video is relevant to both David Schmidt's article, Carol Rose's article, as well as Garrett Hardin's article on the tragedy of the commons. Okay, all right, now just to rehash what is taking place in the tragedy of the commons. The tragedy of the commons is a situation where it's kind of a prisoner's dilemma situation where we understand that it's in mutually everybody's best interest to be temperate with our use of natural resources, particularly land. But we also know that as individuals, we stand to benefit from using more of those resources. So the common examples that are often referred to involve grazing with animals. So clearly, if I have two animals on a plot of land, and I would profit more from increasing the amount of grazing animals that I have on that land as much as I can. I just keep adding animals because I stand to profit from that. I also am aware of the fact that everybody else that is using that commons area, so a commons area would be something that is not only public, it would be something that is completely unregulated. So we're just talking about the use of land and resources for which there are no kinds of regulations whatsoever. What inevitably this ends up with is just a complete ruin of that commons area. Since we're all treating it the same way, we all benefit from the use of this common resource, but since it's a common resource and its use is not regulated, that means that nobody is primarily responsible for its upkeep. Nobody is primarily responsible for making sure that the resources are not overused. No, there aren't any regulations in place to make sure that we're leaving enough for everybody else. And Garrett Hardin takes this as an indication that this is why we need strong regulations in place. So Hardin thinks that what we need are really sort of authoritarian restrictions on who does and does not get to use the land. He's open to the possibility of dividing the land up into private parcels and partitions and things like that. But at the end of the day, Hardin thinks that economically speaking and resource-wise, it's going to be disastrous for everybody for there to be sort of common areas. Now, part of the problem related to the tragedy of the commons is known as the problem of externalities. All right. Now, when we're talking about externalities economically, what we're talking about are how we weigh the benefits of the use of a resource with the costs of using it. Now, when we're talking about externalities, they can be positive or negative. A lot of times they're talked about in terms of negative externalities. So a negative externality would be the cost of using a resource, but that cost is placed upon an independent or third party. So, for example, if I own a factory and just in the process of making my products, whatever they are, I'm dumping a bunch of waste into the river. If I'm dumping that waste into the river, knowing full well that all of that waste is going to be flowing downriver and impacting other people's property, not my property, but other people's property. That would be an externality. So as a result of my industry, I am placing the burden on other individuals to take care of that sort of negative cost. So part of the problem with the tragedy of the commons is every single one of us in the use of the commons, we're not only taking away from the resources by grazing, but it's also a matter of what we're putting into it in terms of waste and pollution and things like that. So it's just a matter of fact that every time we use resources in a certain kind of way, we are going to be leaving waste. So we're not only taking away from the resources through their use, we're also adding negative things to the resource. All right. Okay. Now, as far as the tragedy of the commons goes, some distinctions need to be made here, and Carol Rose talks about this in her article. First of all, there seems to be a conflation between a complete unregulated commons with a regulated public area. So Garrett Hardin, for example, describes national parks as commons area, but technically that's not correct. It's really not correct to talk about national parks as commons areas. Why? Because those areas are regulated. You know, it's not as if nobody pays a cost for their upkeep. We all pay a cost for their upkeep primarily through taxation and things like that. And secondly, and this is something that I'll be talking about a little later in the video, a lot of times we don't need formal prohibitions or formal regimes or institutions of property. Like we don't need a formalized regime of property talking about how property is going to be distributed and how we determine ownership and all of that. A lot of times when it comes to the institution of property, a lot of it just involves kind of common bonds that we have with each other. So it largely depends upon how close-knit a group is, but a lot of property boundaries and things like that are enforced by custom rather than sort of fences and strict sort of conditions that we all sort of unanimously or a majority of us agree upon as members of society. So the idea that we need sort of a formalized or institutionalized property regime environmentally or just for society in general, that's not necessarily the case. So both David Schmitz and Carol Rose give various examples of this, how things are ruled by custom. So when we talk about when the plains of the plains areas of the United States of America were used for grazing, there was just kind of a set of unwritten rules among the cowboys and the herders. Now, eventually, as more people came into that resource, that's when branding started, just to make sure that my cattle didn't get mixed up with your cattle and things like that. So we might need more formalized or institutionalized property regimes when more individuals are coming to use a resource or when that resource is becoming low or scarce. So that is an important concern. I really like this example from David Schmitz. David Schmitz talks about sort of familial units as operating by custom. So he talks about the living room of the house. So this is a common area. Why? Largely because it's not regulated who does and does not get to use it, but there are kind of unspoken customary rules here. So we don't have a formalized or institutionalized regime of private property for our family living rooms or family rooms, and yet we function very well with them. So if I go into the living room and my kids are watching something on the TV, I know not because there's a rule in the house, a formalized, institutionalized rule in the house, but I know that if I don't want to watch what they're watching, I will need to go into a different room. If they're watching some annoying Disney movie or something like that, and I'm like, oh, I don't want to watch this. Even though I'm their dad, I don't have the jurisdiction to sort of turn the TV off or change the channel and force them to go somewhere else. Why? They were there kind of before I was. All right. Okay. Now, and the other concern here, and this is what David Schmitz talks about primarily in the institution of private property, is how exactly what's known as original appropriation of land or resources comes to be. So when we're talking about original appropriation, we are talking about how an individual or a group of individuals can have a claim of ownership over a parcel of land or over certain kinds of resources. Okay, now, and this is different from what's called expropriation. So that would involve pushing people or pushing individuals off of their land or stealing their resources. And as David Schmitz indicates, clearly in the history of humanity, there is a documented history of doing this very kind of thing, where we have individuals, hey, I like your land, and I think I'll just take it. Well, we've been here for a long time. Well, it doesn't matter, So there's a funny skit by the comedian Eddie Izzard where he talks about this. We steal land through the use of flags. So he says the Brits go to India and say, yes, we claim India for Britain. Well, why? Well, because we have a flag, and we put the flag in the ground, and that means that it's ours. And if you don't have a flag, you don't have a country. So by that logic, that would mean that the United States owned the moon, since we were the first ones there, and we put a flag down. But that's another matter. Okay, now, but when we're talking about the institution of private property, this is what's known as the Lockean proviso. So John Locke, classical liberal philosopher and theorist, thinks that the right to private property is actually a natural right. Okay, now, so clearly the difference between a natural right and a social right is this. So social rights are those that we have in virtue of living in certain societal arrangements or boundaries. A natural right is a right that you possess independently of any society. So when we're talking about the natural state of human individuals, the natural state of human individuals is our condition prior to there being any kind of legislation or organized law in society or anything like that. So if the right to private property is a natural right, that means that you as an individual have the right to private property independently of living in any kind of society or independently of there even being a certain kind of society. Now, and this makes more sense when we're talking about appropriation of frontier land or untamed wilderness that has not been cultivated by any individuals agriculturally, or the land is not producing through the efforts of human beings. So again, we're not talking about situations where I and a bunch of other individuals with bigger guns than you come to your farm and like what you've done here and then push you off your farm and take ownership of it. No, we're talking about, okay, when we're talking about a frontier parcel of land or frontier resources that no individual has laid claim to, how is it that it comes about that an individual or a group of individuals now have a right to claim it? Okay, now, so this is how John Locke thinks that this works. How this works is that when we are moving into a frontier area, or we're kind of in the wilderness trying to make lives for ourselves and for our loved ones and things like that, even if it's a group of individuals, we need to use the land and we need to use the resources to survive, obviously. So we need food, we need shelter, um, we need agriculture and things like that. You know, the very survival of the group depends upon using the land in this kind of way. Now, but what happens is in the process of doing so, since we use natural resources in this kind of way, our labor gets mixed up with the natural resources. So it's not only through the natural resources that we come to make a life on this plot of land, it's also through our labor and our toil that we come to make a life for ourselves on this plot of land. So if I am on a frontier homestead and I build a log cabin for myself through the natural resources that are available to me, it wouldn't make any sense for you to come along and say, hey, I want this land. Well, you didn't do anything to work for it. Your labor and toil was not put into cultivating and using these resources and using this land in any kind of way. And since I have labored and toiled to make something of this parcel of land or to use the resources for my own enrichment, the enrichment of my family, or the enrichment of a group of individuals, it does seem that I have a legitimate claim to this parcel of land or these resources, and you don't. Okay, now, and this is a really important point, so let me back up here. And this is the difference between having a liberty to something and having a right to something. Okay, so when we're talking about a liberty, all we are talking about is freedom to use. So you have liberties in terms of being able to function in certain kinds of ways. So you are at liberty to go to a national park or to go to a public park. However, having a right to something not only involves freedom to use, a right to something also involves the freedom to exclude others. That is a major difference here. So when we're talking about a right to private property, a right to private property does not only mean that I am free to use this land and these resources for whatever reason that I see fit, I also have the right to exclude other people from using this land and these resources in certain kinds of ways. So I have a right to say this is mine and not yours. Well, why? Well, because I was the one that made something here. It's because my labor and my toil and my work is interwoven. It's because of all of that that I have a legitimate claim not only to use, I'm at liberty to use this land and its resources for the sake of my own betterment and enrichment and the betterment and enrichment of my family and my friends or the group, whoever. I also have a right to say to you newcomers, no, you're going to have to make something for yourself in a different way. So since this land is already taken and this land is already being used, I have the right to exclude you from its use. Okay, so that's what we're talking about with original appropriation. We're not talking about whether or not we're free to use the land and its resources. We're talking about whether or not we have the right to exclude other individuals from its use. So again, you and I are both at liberty to go to public parks. We are both at liberty to go to national parks. But with a common usage area, even if it's public, it's not a commons. You know, playgrounds are regulated. Since it's a regulated public area, which we're all at liberty to use, I don't have a right to exclude other people from its use. So if my kids are sitting on the swings, if there are 3 other swings available, and you come along with your kids and you want to swing, I don't have the right to say these are our swings. Well, there's 3 that you're not using. No, it doesn't matter. It's ours. We can use it for whatever we wish. So we're all at liberty, but we don't have the right to exclude. And that's a major difference between the liberty to use land in a certain kind of way and then having a right to that land or having a right to those kinds of resources. Okay, so my slides got a little out of order here, so let me skip ahead here. Okay, now, and when we're talking about whether or not the Lockean proviso can be justified, these are kinds of the concerns that David Schmitz and Carol Rose talk about. All right. Now, the other aspect of the Lockean proviso doesn't only involve original appropriation, it's whether or not it can actually be justified. And some thinkers think that the Lockean proviso cannot be justified, and here's why. It's part of the Lockean proviso that when it comes to land and resources that we use, in order for its use to be just, we have to leave enough for other people to use. So if my use of the land or my use of the resource would sort of prevent other individuals from having equal to what I have. So if I go in and I take all the land, I build log cabins everywhere, and I say, these are all my log cabins. You don't get to build one because I've taken up all the land. That would not be just. So even though we are free to claim a piece of land and have a rights to that piece of land through our labor and our toil in that kind of way, our labor and our toil in that piece of land can't sort of completely exhaust the resources that are available. So other individuals need to at least have the equal propensity to make something of themselves. Now, whether they actually do or not is another matter entirely. So if I'm really good at building log cabins and you're not, the fact that you come to a frontier parcel of land and you fail, you don't survive the winter, that's not on me. You at least had equal resources available to you. So that's what we're talking about here. So all we need is to make sure that whatever resources I use, I leave enough behind so that everybody else can use as much as I do. That's the important qualification here. So that is necessary in order for original appropriation to be just. So if I exhaust the resources in such a way so that other individuals don't have the same kind of at least materials to make some sort of make something for themselves using their own labor. Again, whether they're actually successful is another matter. That is going to be necessary in order for original appropriation to be just. All right. Now, and individuals that say that original appropriation is not just might say so for this reason. Thompson in David Schmidt's article mentions that original appropriation is a zero-sum game. Meaning that when I take something from the land, I automatically leave other individuals with less than they had before. So think about it this way. If you and I both want a cookie and I take a cookie, I'm leaving less cookies for you automatically. So Thompson says, well, everything that we do affects everybody else. Everything that we do affects everybody else. So a zero-sum game would mean that when I benefit, when I have a net benefit of something, somebody else automatically has a net decrease or is just by default put at some kind of disadvantage. Now, and if that is the case, if my use of the land and its resources benefits me and it automatically deprives another individual of something, then original appropriation would be a zero-sum game. Now, but this is what David Schmitz says. David Schmitz makes the point that original appropriation is not a zero-sum game. And here is why. The reason why original appropriation is not a zero-sum game is because a lot of times people that come after the land is cultivated actually benefit more. So the people that come after a homestead is established, and not only a homestead, but now we have a community, now we have a town, now we have established agriculture, now we have an established system of government, now we have an established system of laws. Okay, so the newcomers to the situation, they didn't do anything to establish our little community, which is now starting to thrive, but they actually benefit from the labor and the toil of others. So it's the individuals that are originally coming to a parcel of land, and trying to make something of it. They're the ones that are exerting a lot of the effort and exerting a lot of the work, and other people are benefiting from their work. Well, if it's not fair through my labor to deprive other individuals, it also seems that it's not fair for other people to benefit from my labor without actually contributing to it. So David Schmidt says, no, given what we know historically about how homesteading has worked, original appropriation is not a zero-sum game. Future generations and other individuals that are going to be coming later, they're actually going to be benefiting more from the cultivation and the use of that land, largely through agriculture and getting a more established community and society off of the ground. They actually stand to benefit more from original appropriation than the original appropriators do. So it's not a zero-sum game at all. Okay, now, but David Schmitz also says that the commons prior to appropriation is not a zero-sum game either. It's often a negative-sum game. So not only do those who originally come to occupy a place of land have to work for it, they have to clear thorns and thistles, they have to plow the land, they have to make sure that it's properly irrigated so that the crops will grow, they have constantly need to be concerned with survival because nature is hostile, especially when we're talking about untamed wilderness and untamed frontier, land that has not been cultivated through human hands. So not only do they need to work for it and stand to benefit, but as we've seen historically from example after example after example after example, things might not actually go so well for them. So David Schmitz thinks of Jamestown as the Jamestown colony as a perfect example of this. So hey, we got this land and we're going to work it, but then most people didn't survive the first winter. So it's the original appropriators that are actually assuming the greatest amount of risk in coming to cultivate land for the very first time. So not only is original appropriation not a zero-sum game, commons area, originally coming to an untamed and unregulated commons and trying to cultivate it and, build something off of it, that's not a zero-sum game either. That is often a negative-sum game.